Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I am your host, TJ Mabardi. Today we are still in this little bit of a dead time in terms of live sports that are going on. So we are going to be touching on a little bit of brief news with the Brooklyn Nets, who just yesterday decided to fire their head coach, Jacque Vaughn. We'll be touching on that in the future of that organization. We will be then sort of doing a little bit more opinionated stories here. I'm going to be doing an exercise with stock up and stock down for the lottery picks of the past few NBA drafts, before then doing a segment evaluating this current rookie class and the 2023 NBA draft, that is. And then finally, I am going to finish off the show by giving my NFL teams that have the most pressure behind them heading into next season. Before we get into all that, just a reminder to like and follow wherever you may be catching us. For our live viewers, to use the chat to make this show as interactive as possible, and to consider donating by using that link that is scrolling on the bottom ticker throughout the course of the show. With all of that being said, getting into our first topic of the day, the Brooklyn Nets deciding to fire Jacque Vaughn yesterday. Unfortunately, on his day off, a little sad, but I can't say that I was extremely surprised by this. The Nets have been a pretty tough watch this year as a whole, and I want to acknowledge the fact that I don't think that Jacque Vaughn had it easy necessarily from the moment that he stepped into the building. There were very interesting circumstances sort of around him getting hired. He was the candidate to replace Steve Nash after a rough start to the season last year. And it was initially reported that they were interested in going after Ime Udoka, who had just been fired the previous offseason by the Celtics for some still unknown allegations, but it sounds like he had an inappropriate relationship with somebody within the building of some sorts. So it was a little bit strange. I don't know if the NBA was really going to let it fly. Udoka getting a job that quick. Obviously, he gets hired by the Rockets this past offseason. But, you know, I feel like the NBA was sort of going to step in, and it had to be at least a year in between him getting his next job and whatever went down in the past there. But they do end up going with Jacque Vaughn. It sounds like some of the superstar players that were there between Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving were sort of pushing for this hire, so that's what they end up doing. And shortly after, he had to deal with a lot of different transitional pieces based off of the fact that both Kyrie and KD requested trades shortly after his hire. So he obviously had to deal with a lot of very complicated factors throughout all of that. Vaughn ends up finishing his tenure with the Nets 71-68 as a whole. That is including a little bit of an interim role he held when Kenny Atkinson was fired a few years ago, and he finished out the end of that season. But, you know, when you look at that 71-68 record, I think that, you know, he largely benefited from having KD and Kyrie last season. He takes over in Brooklyn in early November after Nash was fired, and obviously KD ends up getting hurt last year. In January, they were able to still float around that 500 mark in terms of the games that he wasn't playing, but overall last season he was 30-15 during the year when both KD and Kyrie were on the roster. They both get traded in early February, and the wheels really start falling off for them there. They went 13-17 after that Kyrie trade. They end up making it to the playoffs based off of the ability to sort of stay afloat and build up that bit of a lead that they did going into the break. But then they get to the playoffs and they were swept. Vaughn finishes 0-8 in his Brooklyn tenure as far as playoff record goes. The Nets were 21-33 this year, so including the playoff games as well that he lost last year, in total after those trades, they were 34-54. So definitely pretty unsuccessful there. It's interesting though, because obviously Vaughn was able to keep the Nets sort of in play during that stretch for a bit there, where there was no Kevin Durant and it was just Kyrie Irving, and there were still some interesting circumstances going on around Kyrie himself, and they actually gave him a multi-year extension late in February last season. Now, obviously, just 12 months later, they fire him. So, I mean, the team has been really bad this year. There is a good amount of Nets fans, I feel like, that have been calling for this. Now, the timing is what's a little bit up for debate, because if you look at how this season has been going as a whole for them, like I mentioned, a 21-33 record. They're currently outside of the play-in tournament. They are just 9-15 in clutch games this season. They have been a very bad fourth quarter team this year. They are 20th in the league in fourth quarter net rating at -2.5, and specifically the defense has been horrendous for them in the fourth quarter this year. The most points allowed in clutch minutes per game during the course of the season, so they really haven't been able to close out these games. They've been in a handful of them, but have not been able to capitalize, and they decide to move on from Jacque Vaughn. So again, the timing of this is a little bit interesting because it's coming out of the All-Star break, the halfway point, and we're going to get into sort of the future of this team as well, but on one hand, why fire him in the middle of the year? If you came into the season thinking that he was going to be the guy, don't you sort of let him play out the rest of this season and see if there's any sort of a redemption that they can come to? But on the same note, if you don't think he's the guy, why keep him around for the rest of the season? And again, as we get into sort of what the future looks like for this Nets team, they don't have many of their first round picks. They don't actually control their own first round pick until 2028, I believe it is. So they have no incentive to be bad right now. Like, the whole idea of, well, you can just bottom out and sort of rebuild from there, that's not really an option for them in this instance. So they are trying to be competitive, or at least as competitive as possible today. And so their plan for them going forward, they are promoting their assistant coach, Kevin Ollie, to be the interim head coach for the rest of the season. Adrian Wojnarowski, he reported that they are looking to rebuild around Mikal Bridges, and this has brought up a little bit of an interesting conversation around that. I've seen sort of a lot of slander online for Mikal Bridges, and I like Bridges a lot. It is interesting considering him to be, a franchise centerpiece moving forward, considering the fact that he is 27 years old. He showed a lot of promise. He averaged 26 points per game in the latter half of the season last year after being traded from Phoenix to the Nets in that Kevin Durant deal. But he's taken a step back this year in terms of really showing that he can be a true number one option. He has dipped just a few points, but down to 22 points per game this season on worse shooting splits. He's averaging a career high in assists, at least. It's 3.7, I believe. So, it's not that he's incapable of being an initiator per se, but it is just as a whole, the idea of trying to, especially without any of your own draft picks, to sort of go through this rebuilding process with someone that is supposed to already be in their prime and their roster as a whole is not a championship contender level yet. So it's a little bit of an interesting decision, and I guess we'll see how this all plays out. Like I mentioned, don't have very many of their picks at all through all of the shuffling they did these past few seasons, because if you remember back a decade ago, they move a ton of their draft capital to make a trade with the Boston Celtics where they bring in Paul Pierce, Kevin Durant, Jason Terry, all of that, and form a little bit of a super team. Then that falls short and they lose out on key draft capital then. Then they piece together this pretty fun team where they had a D'Angelo Russell in his all-star season. Spencer Dinwiddie was playing really good basketball. Karis LeVert as well. And they were just kind of this fun, challenging team. You knew that they weren't a championship contender, but they played hard on a nightly basis. And the D'Angelo Russell at that point, because it was a little bit of a resurgence for him after things got pretty ugly there at the end of his first tenure with the Lakers. So they were a lot of fun. And then getting the opportunity to come in and get Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving and pair up that matchup, that's when they sort of started to sell off again. And we saw them trade a bunch of picks in that for James Harden as well. They moved draft capital, including also trading Jared Allen, who I think is a very underrated sort of piece that went out during all of these moves, because Jared Allen is, an all defensive caliber player in that front court that they had that also added to this team as well. Now, it's not like they're necessarily short-handed there now with Nick Claxton and Day'Ron Sharpe, but definitely could have gotten more value for a failed experiment there with James Harden specifically. I don't blame them for making the Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving moves, especially because part of the motivation behind that was to try and, during this time where the Knicks were sort of at a low point, have them capture that New York basketball energy, and that obviously did not end up being the case. But the Kyrie and Durant pairing, I don't really give them too much slack for. I think that it was a pretty understandable decision, but the moving Jared Allen and just sort of almost including him as a throwaway in that deal was definitely a negative in my opinion. Now, because of that, they've also shifted around all these picks, trading off James Harden, Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving. So they have some draft capital moving forward, but again, not their own first-round pick until 2028. They have 3 different unprotected first-round picks from Phoenix. They have one in 2025. They have one in 2027 and one in 2029. Those last 2 could end up being valuable. They have an unprotected first-round pick from the Dallas Mavericks in 2029 as well. That could end up being a very valuable pick if things don't work out there with Luka and with Kyrie. I think that we've talked about it on the show a bunch of times now. That was a very risky move when they made it, and we'll see, because if Luka is gone there, they've at this point themselves given up a lot of their own draft picks, so they could be in a very tough position by 2029. They also included their second round pick, so let's say the Mavs end up with the first overall draft pick in 2029. They're sending that to Brooklyn, as well as their early second round pick as well. So, it's still very much up in the air for the Nets right now, but these could end up being valuable picks. That's if they choose that they want to hold on to them themselves, or they could potentially look to sort of trade these if you're thinking that you don't want to wait until 2028. It's 2027 for that Suns pick, but if you're banking on all of this draft capital down the road and you don't even have your own, maybe you want to package some of these picks together to try and make yourselves better today. Because again, there's no point in being bad for you. You don't get to go through the typical rebuilding stages there. They have these picks that could be valuable, could definitely be interesting trade assets come the offseason. You also have a contract in Ben Simmons that's $40 million. So if you wanted to package these with a Ben Simmons, you could get a more expensive player out there on the market. What that's going to be exactly, I don't know. But, we've had all these rumors about Donovan Mitchell to the Knicks because he's from New York and all of that. I don't really see a Jalen Brunson and Donovan Mitchell backcourt really playing out for them all too well. Just, it's a little bit redundant, both undersized players. Neither of them are significantly fantastic on the defensive end. They both need the ball in their hands a lot, but maybe the Nets come in and try and make an offer for Donovan Mitchell to bring him back to New York, but across the state into Brooklyn, and pair him up with Mikal Bridges could be an interesting fit, in my opinion. They do have the majority of their roster under contract going forward, which at least gives them some flexibility as far as what they would like to do going forward. The upcoming free agents for them, Nick Claxton, which is a crucial decision for them to make. He's going to be unrestricted. I thought they could have gotten a decent package for him at the trade deadline, but they decide to not move him. They have Day'Ron Sharpe in the ranks as well if they want to sort of give him some more minutes. I like both of them. I think they're very complimentary of one another, but we will see sort of what they decide to do with that. And then they have Dennis Smith Jr. and Lonnie Walker are the only other unrestricted free agents. Keita Bates-Diop, who they got in that Royce O'Neal trade, he has a player option that I feel like he's going to decline, but, we'll see. So all in all, they have a lot of different assets that they could sort of move around. There's Ben Simmons. Dorian Finney-Smith supposedly was getting offers of 2 first-round picks. They decide to not go with that, which I don't really love the decision to not move him if you really could get a package like that. But you know what? At the end of the day, they didn't decide to. Maybe they swing back around to it in the offseason. We'll sort of see. Cam Johnson is, I think, another very interesting forward that could potentially have some value for them in the future. So, a lot still to see here with the Nets. They have a lot of different options, and it's going to be an unconventional path one way or another. So for now, we'll see. I mean, again, we're probably going to see them try and make a push down the stretch of this season under Kevin Ollie to try and make the play-in tournament. They're only a couple games out of it, so it is definitely possible, but we are going to have to see some real improvements on that front if they are hoping to do so. So that is all we have on the Nets situation for now. We're going to be taking our first break, and when we come back on the other side, we will be doing a little exercise, stock up/down for recent lottery picks. So stick with us. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh. I feel like I'm losing my mind.
Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just finished up talking about the Nets' decision to move on from Jacque Vaughn for the second half of their year. Now we're going to be doing a little more opinionated stuff down the stretch of the show here, where there's not too much live sports action going on other than some college basketball right now, which did get a top 10 matchup last night that was pretty entertaining, but that is not really the focus of this show exactly just yet. Right now we're going to be doing an exercise called Stock Up/Down for recent NBA lottery picks. I have a list of a bunch of guys here, not every single lottery pick from the past few years, but I'm specifically going to be looking at the 2020, 2021, and 2022 drafts, and I just feel like it's a little bit too early to judge some of these rookies in terms of the stock. Like this exercise that I'm going to run here, we are going to be touching on the rookies in the next segment by themselves, but just as a note, I don't have any of the number one picks necessarily in these categories just now. I think that if you're thinking stocks wise, they were already very high coming into the league, and I think that they've all been great between all three of them. I don't think that they've necessarily risen all too much like we've seen sort of the reputations of some of these other guys where there was more of an unknown, but I consider Anthony Edwards, Cade Cunningham, and Paolo Banchero all to be on the higher side in terms of what their future projects to be, how I feel about them going forward, all of that. So on that note, getting into the biggest risers here, I have Tyrese Halliburton, Jonathan Kuminga, Jalen Duren, Jalen Williams, Franz Wagner, Jalen Suggs, Denny Avdia, and Devin Vassell. Not going to be touching on every single one of these guys, but definitely giving my thoughts on a handful of them. Tyrese Halliburton, this is sort of the obvious one here. I'm not going to spend all too much time on it because at this point everybody knows how good he is. He was the 12th overall pick in 2020, and it's very interesting to me because he's somebody that came in with a very unconventional jump shot, still has an unconventional jump shot, but I really do feel like that turned a lot of people away at the time of his draft, and he's come out and he's been an absolute star, especially since getting traded from the Kings, being able to fully show off the playmaking and scoring ability that he has. I know that he was struggling a little bit headed into that span in between the in-season tournament where he was really putting people on notice and the All-Star break. His numbers dipped a little bit, but I still think he's incredible. I think that he is headed for his first All-NBA selection this year. I think that he's sort of that similar jump to what Shai Gilgeous-Alexander did as of last season, but Tyrese is doing it a little bit earlier in his career as well. Kuminga, we've talked about him a ton. He has been incredible for the Warriors, especially as of the last month, somebody that came in as much more of a raw prospect and is finally being able to put himself and these skills together. The Warriors are accepting that this maybe isn't quite their championship contending year, but that they really do have something in a couple of these young draft guys, and Jonathan Kuminga is one of them. It's been awesome to see him flourish. Jalen Duren is somebody that I love watching. Honestly, I do love watching the Pistons. I think that when you get them on a good night, they do compete hard. They lose a lot. They're sort of like the Grizzlies team that I've talked about in the past as well, as far as there are people that they feel like they still have to prove themselves, and so they compete. They're maybe not, top-end talent good enough just yet, but Duren I have seen tons of improvement with. I think that when he was coming in the 2022 draft class, I was sort of at a point where he was with a lot of big-name guys at Memphis. Imani Bates was one of them, and it was under this new Penny Hardaway team, and I was really disappointed to see the way that team sort of fell short and they weren't good. And I was confused why Jalen Duren at first was quite as highly touted as he was. And then it was really during the course of that draft season I understood, it's because this guy projects to be so much more. He's with an inexperienced team. He is in a situation where there's not a ton of spacing for him. But what this guy can be is a really good two-way player for them, a rim roller. And what I've been impressed with, because the defense and the rebounding, that was already there, but I've seen him really start to be more aggressive with the ball in his hands. He has been a lot more improved of an individual player, but still plays into the team setting as well. So I've had a ton of fun watching Jalen Duren this year. Another guy that I want to point out in this group as well is Deni Avdija. He was the 9th pick in 2020, sorry. There's always been, this reputation of being a talented wing defender, but this season we've seen the offense take a significant jump, and it's not like the numbers are otherworldly necessarily, but we've seen the team trust him to do more with the ball. He's having a career high in usage percentage, career highs in points and assists, and the shooting splits have been very much improved, jumped from 44 and sub 30 last year to 52 and 40 this year. And this is a result of him shooting a career high 71% at the rim and hitting 50% of threes from the corner. Not shooting specifically the threes at necessarily an incredible volume, but still 36% on non-corner threes. And you know what? He's been effective in sort of the limited looks that he's been doing. He understands his own game. This is a work in progress for him. And as a result, we saw him smash his career high last week versus the Pelicans. It was 25, and then he dropped to 43 against the Pelicans while still playing good defense on the other end. Didn't see him abandon that true identity that he has, and he has been, they end up losing that game, but they were down 20. He sort of claws them back into it, and we're talking about the Wizards here, who going into the year, I thought that they had the most grim situation across the league. They didn't really have any, cornerstone guys for them. We'll talk about one of their other draft picks within the past few years, but Avdija has really seemed to be a guy that, could have a very bright future. He's still just 23 years old. He just turned 23 within the past month or so. So he's got a very bright future in my perspective, and I think that he's somebody they can absolutely build around. They have, again, not really talking about this year's rookie class, but they added Bilal Coulibaly as well, another international guy, another guy that has a lot of raw talent, is very young, was one of the youngest in his class. So we can see them sort of build these two together and sort of evaluate from there. Biggest fallers I have from these past few draft classes, I just sort of alluded to it. Johnny Davis, who was the 10th overall pick for the Wizards in 2022. He has been he wasn't even the youngest coming in his class as well. He had a couple years behind him, but he has been a major disappointment for them. James Wiseman, James Bouknight, Joshua Primo, Patrick Williams, Killian Hayes, and Kyra Lewis. So don't want to get on Johnny Davis too much because at this point, sort of what's the point? But James Wiseman has been one that has hurt me personally the most for myself, because I loved the idea of him as a prospect coming out of high school and then briefly college. And I'm sure Warriors fans can feel the pain more so even than I can. It's interesting to look back because the position that the Warriors were in at that point in 2020, where they were just a couple years removed, that is, from being a championship winner. Then they were able to have this second overall pick in 2020, and they end up coming away with just about nothing. if you look at this draft class, I mean, can you imagine Tyrese Halliburton in this system that the Warriors run? Like, it would have been so incredible to watch. That being said, Halliburton was never going to go number 2 in the draft. It's just not what he was necessarily looked at the time. LaMelo Ball was sort of the name that would have been more so reasonable to expect the Warriors to take at this slot. Which still also would have been very entertaining to watch. I mean, Wiseman just never really had it. There is a big thing with him when it comes to sort of the defensive IQ and the awareness. The fit was just never really there. I saw a very interesting clip the other day of Draymond talking to Wiseman on the court. Wiseman said something along the lines of, "Oh, I didn't see it." And Draymond's like, "Yeah, I know you didn't see it. That's why I'm talking to you." And it just never worked out there. He ends up just getting them a handful of second-round picks, so definitely disappointing there. Killian Hayes is the other name I want to briefly touch on here. 7th overall pick in that same 2020 class. A lot of people loved him coming into the draft. He had a lot of love coming from overseas. He's a strong defender. He's a good playmaker. The question was always, can that offense develop? And the answer was no. He never really got to be efficient of any sorts from the field. The Pistons ended up waiving him at the trade deadline this year after being unable to find a trade partner. I think that, the ceiling is definitely not as high as it was looked at to be before, but I am curious if you are a team like the San Antonio Spurs, you are not looking to compete this year, and you are looking for a point guard to run more of an actual system around. I don't know why they wouldn't take a flyer on him, but I mean, at this point, it seems like it could be a little bit of a lost cause. It's been a couple weeks. He still has not found a home yet. I'm sure that's going to change at some point. I'm sure somebody else is going to give him a shot, but it doesn't look great as of now. Kyra Lewis, I also had in that tier if I did not mention him there. Some slight stock up for a handful of people. I have Keegan Murray, Jabari Smith Jr., Jaden Ivey, Benedict Mathurin, Aaron Nesmith, and Jalen Smith. We have a lot of guys from the 2022 draft class. Keegan Murray is one that I think has really, soared the most in terms of that list of guys. It wasn't a very popular pick at the time. I myself thought that they were sort of reaching and trying to draft more so for draft fit as opposed to need. I thought that Jaden Ivey was the better player than Murray headed into this draft, but I thought that they were trying to avoid stocking up too much on guards. And I mean, Murray has been a great fit and a great player for the Kings through his first 1.5 seasons. What is interesting to me is how underrated his defense has been. He has faced the 10th most isolation possessions per game on the defensive end of the floor. He's holding opponents to just 20% shooting. He's second in the league in points per possession in those isolation situations, only behind Evan Mobley. So the question around him is, what is that ceiling? He clearly has more on the defensive end than he was necessarily thought to coming into the league. I think he's an incredibly smart player. He doesn't turn the ball over. The thing is, the shot making hasn't been quite as good this season as we saw in his rookie year. We've seen a pretty significant downtick from last year, which is the only thing that really held me back from putting him in the highest of risers category. He shot 44% from 3 last season. It is down to 28% this year. And he has improved percentages at the rim and in the mid-range, but just not knocking down shots the way that we thought we would have, that he was based off of how he played last season. And we've seen head coach Mike Brown sort of push him to be more of a creator for himself as well. I think that this is happening marginally over time, and I do think that downtick in shooting is just sort of temporary. He was a very good shooter in college as well, so I think it'll come back around. But that's my thoughts on Keegan Murray. quickly to rattle off some of these other 2022 guys, Jabari Smith Jr., I think, is another one who has been a very solid defender, better than we were expecting after last season. A lot of people were questioning his offensive abilities and his athleticism. We still haven't seen this alpha scorer from him that, if you remember, going into last year, a lot of people were buzzing about him potentially being the number one pick over Paolo Banchero and Chet Holmgren. He ends up falling to 3, and, he hasn't been necessarily the alpha guy. That's not what he was in college either. He only shot, I think it was like 10 to 11 shots per game, which I remember doing the draft research at the time. That would have been the lowest for a number one pick since Ben Simmons was drafted all those years ago in 2016, I believe it was. A lot of people thought that this was possibly a result of Bruce Pearl's team offense at Auburn. I think that that's definitely part of it. I think that he also just doesn't really have the comfortability. If you remember, he's a big guy. He stands at 6'10", even longer wingspan. I don't think that he has incredible shot creation ability, not the strongest handle necessarily. Definitely struggles with going to his left. And I think he's a very solid player, very capable starter on both ends of the court. The question is he ever going to be able to reach the ceiling that a lot of people thought that he might headed into that draft? Jaden Ivey had a very weird start to the season under Monty Williams. He was penalized for not being good enough on the defensive end. He wasn't a very good shooter coming into this season, but ever since becoming the regular starter for them, he's been having a very nice turnaround to what was a slow start to the year. He started every game for them since December 18th. At his 28 games, he's averaging 18, 4, and 4 on 46 and 40 shooting splits. He can be a little erratic still in some of the decision making. I love watching Jaden Ivey. Again, I actually do enjoy watching the Pistons. I think they have the cornerstones at guard, forward, and center between him, Cade Cunningham, and Jalen Duren. But turnovers, especially late in the game, have been a real thing with the Pistons this year. And Jaden Ivey is definitely somewhat guilty of that, averaging 2.9 turnovers per game since being a starter. Again, some of these late game decisions can just be a little harmful for the Pistons when they're trying to be in these big moments, but I like a lot of what we've seen from Ivey, especially the improved shooting. He shot just 26% from 3 in his freshman year of college, and we've seen gradual improvement from him year after year. His sophomore year in college, and now his first 2 seasons in the NBA. So I am definitely a fan of Jaden Ivey. My slightly downtrending players, I have Ochai Agbaji, Ousmane Dieng, Jeremy Sohan, Davion Mitchell, Moses Moody, Josh Giddey, and Evan Mobley. As far as this group here, I still have a little bit of stock, I think, in Moses Moody. I've been a big fan of him since he played in college. I think that he came into the year and he looked to be more confident. He was put in situations with the Warriors where, especially in the playoffs last year, he didn't look very certain about where he should be, what he should be doing. I thought that he came in this year seeming to be sort of a higher intelligence player, but we've seen the efficiency drop and we've seen him sort of fall out of the rotation for the Warriors. So somebody that definitely stock is down right now, but I still do have faith in him. And then the last 2 names on this list are a little bit interesting, Josh Giddey and Evan Mobley, because they're both starters on some of the up-and-coming teams in the NBA. And it might be a little strange to have them on this list. Now, with Giddey, we're going to talk just basketball here with him. I think that the shooting has been a real issue. He's not afraid to take some of these shots, specifically the corner threes when he's left wide open, which I think that he should continue to shoot, because at some point you have to be able to keep the defense honest. When you look at the game they played against the Celtics earlier this year, that was a very large factor for why the Thunder were able to pull that game out. He ends up having a hot shooting night, but the offensive limitations in terms of shooting, scoring is definitely hurting him for somebody that I think that a lot of players, a lot of people were really high on him after his first couple seasons. Evan Mobley, I feel a little bit guilty almost having him on this stock down list because I have been a big fan of Mobley as well, going back to USC. The defense is potentially generational with him. I just think that it's really tough. I mean, the position that he's in, I think that the Cavs, for as great of a team they are, I think that they're a little bit redundant at their best positions. I think that Garland and Mitchell do a lot of the same things, and I think that Mobley and Allen do a lot of the same things. And I just don't think that there is necessarily a level, as far as, the way that people were talking about him early in his career, the lack of creation that he can make happen on offense sort of hurts him, I think. He does a lot of what Jarrett Allen does, but Jarrett Allen is just a more efficient player at those things. You'd like to see him develop maybe a little bit of an outside shot, one of the two of them. Jarrett Allen doesn't really seem like he's ever going to have that in his game. Evan Mobley was getting Kevin Garnett comparisons over the course of his first couple seasons, so that's almost why I think the expectations were just really high for him, and as a result, I've had a little bit of a downtick with him, but I'm definitely not out on him as a player as a whole. I also have questions whether or not Cleveland is the best fit for him long term. And then the last few names here that I have neutral, I'm thinking about it. I didn't have Scotty Barnes on this list. I didn't really know where to put him. He's somebody that he won Rookie of the Year. He had a lackluster second season, but he's back to an all-star this year. So I would say, you have to go with, especially if you're looking at where their stock was coming into this season, you have to say he's up. I guess I'd put it slight up, probably could be significantly up. But last few guys here that I have as far as neutral, Jalen Green, Onyeka Okongwu, LaMelo Ball, I think that they all sort of have their things. I like all of these players, but we just see different moments. We see good moments, we see bad moments. LaMelo Ball, the biggest thing with him is staying healthy. The on-court talent is clearly there. He was an all-star in his second season, but health has been a major concern for him over the past couple seasons, and as a result, I didn't really know where to put him. If anything, I was honestly leading on the stock down because I do think that injury concern is real. So on that note, we are going to be taking our next break. When we come back on the other side, we're going to be talking about this past season, the 2023 rookie class, and how they're doing at the midway point. So stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. We went a little long on that last segment, so for this next one, we're going to try and, go through it a little bit faster, but obviously still take up the 15-minute block that we typically do here. This segment, we're going to be evaluating the 2023 NBA Draft rookies up to this point in the season. So again, we're going to move through these a little bit quicker than we did those last ones. Starting off, Victor Wembanyama, he is just about everything that he's lived up to just about all the hype you could have asked for in terms of his rookie season. I think that at this point, he's kind of running away with the Rookie of the Year award. Obviously, now we're getting into the discussions. A lot of people are projecting, well, what's this going to look like going forward? He's been called the top 20 player in the league this year. I don't know if I'm willing to go that far yet. I mean, the defensive impact that he has really is tremendous. You see the flashes on offense. Interestingly enough, he's shooting significantly better off the dribble than he is in catch and shoot situations. You think that that is something that he can definitely end up refining and being that much more dangerous. We've seen the handles that he had coming into the season, and it hasn't looked necessarily the smoothest at all times, specifically earlier in the year when he was making that adjustment. It wasn't the best. I don't know that he needs to really be as much of a dribbling through traffic guy. Like, it's definitely a very strong benefit to be able to have a guy that can grab the rebound on the defensive end after making probably a defensive play and then take the ball up the court himself. He is a threat to pull up in transition, but I don't know how much we need to really see him driving downhill like that. Now, again, if he wants to do that and he can do that successfully, all power to him. I'm very excited to see what the finished product of Wembanyama is, but I think that operating more out of sort of the post-ups and that, I mean, really at all levels, I think that my point is here, I just don't think that he needs to do as much of the dribble creation himself, which also speaks to the San Antonio Spurs, where we've talked about them a couple times now. They need to do a better job of putting floor generals on the court with him to be able to initiate some of the actual offense. Jeremy Sohan, in my last exercise, I had him as a slight stock down. I've never been the biggest Jeremy Sohan guy. I just think that he does a lot and they enable him to do a lot. And there is something there that he's sort of scratching at, but I feel like he sort of gets in the way a little bit of Wemby's progression here. And I mean, nothing's stopping Wemby from being the player that he is, sort of showing us that he definitely could be as the years come. But I think that if anything was going to, it's going to be what the Spurs put around him. So I have been all in on Wemby, and it's been a lot of fun. Number 2 pick, Brandon Miller. Brandon Miller, I've given him some love on the show before. I feel like it's flying very under the radar in terms of the type of season that he has. We're seeing the maturity on both ends, and it's not just the ability to play defense, but his desire to really want to and to have his teammates playing as well. Like, he's getting in the grills of his teammates that aren't running back on defense, and he is locked in on both sides. I think that, I mean, really, if you look back to his freshman season at Alabama, when all of the drama was going around about when he was somehow connected to this gun charge that went on with somebody else at the school, he played a game against South Carolina where they were chanting "lock him up" all throughout the game, and he put on one of the best performances of his freshman season scoring wise. I think that he's just one of those guys. We've seen him in that moment. We've seen him this year. I really do think that he's wired differently. And I was more so on the Scoot Henderson, who we're going to get to in a minute. I was more so on the Scoot Henderson train coming into this draft class. I thought that, once again, sort of like I talked about with the last one, I thought that the Hornets were making a little bit of a mistake drafting more so for fit than for the best player available. But Brandon Miller has definitely proven me wrong. I've had a lot of fun watching him this year, and I think that he's going to continue to get better. On that note, Scoot Henderson definitely had a rough start to the season, dealt with some injuries early on that held him back, and the efficiency has not been great for him this year. But I think that if you look at sort of the past few draft classes and the way that we've seen some of these guys like Luka, like Trae Young come out, and I mean, Trae even struggled early on as well, but I feel like we forget how historically it takes a couple years, maybe even, for these young guards to develop. And Scoot Henderson, he hit some bumps early in his career, but I think that he has been really impressive since then. If you look back to the start of 2024, coming into this new calendar year, his career high in assists was 7. He has now eclipsed that mark on 7 different times, getting up to 11 in a couple games, 10 in a couple games, and a few 9 assist marks. I think that we're seeing him definitely mature as a floor general. The game is starting to slow down for him. His decision making is getting better over time, which is something that I think is a really positive sign, because Scoot is somebody who the floor for him is there just based off of how athletic he is. I think that he reminds me a lot of Russell Westbrook. It's just a matter of sort of nailing down that efficiency and being able to score from outside. The efficiency still is down right now. He's shooting 38-31 splits, but again, I think that if you watch him throughout the course of the year, you are seeing him be able to take some necessary steps in the developmental path. Moving forward, I'm putting these guys together for a handful of different reasons. Amen and Ausar Thompson, evaluating them together because they look and they play identical. Their profiles are very similar up to this point. A little unfair, maybe, but it honestly is uncanny how similar their seasons have gone for their rookie years. They are both horrendous perimeter shooters. So much so that StatMuse had this. They are the 2 lowest 3-point percentage shooters on 1 or more attempts per game. Ausar Thompson is shooting 15.5% from 3. Amen is shooting 15.8. They're both all right from mid-range, shooting around 40%, but that was their thing coming into the league, was their perimeter shooting, and it has been pretty abysmal so far up to this point. Amen has been showing a little more flashes as of late, scored 19 twice in February, which is his career high. And you see with both of these guys, the defense is absolutely there. Their steal numbers are very solid. They're not maybe out of the charts. They're not quite yet, obviously, like all defensive team just yet. But I think that is definitely the surface. I think that Amen Thompson can absolutely be around there. And Ausar came out very hot on the rebounds, the steals, the blocks early in the year. So I still think these guys have very high ceilings, but the offensive efficiency has to get better. Both decently high turnover percentages. Free throws aren't falling for them, both in the low 60s. So they're good defenders, they're hustle guys, but until we see that next level of scoring ability, I think that it is going to be a little bit of reservations. So on that note, we're going to start skipping around a little bit now that we are outside of the top 5. Cason Wallace, the number 10 overall pick for OKC, I think has played his role very well. He comes off the bench for the most part for them, but he plays incredibly hard defense, and he's shooting 44% on catch and shoot threes. So he is somebody that has a very strong upside, in my opinion. And, he came into a team that, yes, young, but definitely had expectations that they were going to potentially be making the jump, and they have done so up to this point. And Wallace has found a way to be a contributing member of the team, which I like to see. Derek Lively was the 12th overall pick. Talked about him and the Mavs a bunch as well. I think that he's a great fit as a roller and lob threat alongside both Luka and Kyrie. I also think that his defense has been a lot more mature than I was expecting coming into the year. And for a team that isn't very good on the defensive end, and the reason why I thought going into the year, I didn't think the Mavs were going to make the playoffs because I didn't think they were going to be able to get stops and they were going to be so reliant on this big guy. He has not been the weakest part of the defense. He's been a very solid defensive anchor. Now, when we get to the playoffs and he's going to have to go up against a Karl Anthony Towns or an Anthony Davis, I think things will be different. But I absolutely love how he's looked so far this year. Been dealing with injuries as of late, but I think will definitely be a contributing player down the stretch of this year and should be down the over the course of the next few years for sure. Keontae George, I've been talking about a lot lately, I feel like, so I won't go on too long about him, but he was the 16th overall pick. He has been a ton of fun to watch. I just think that the scoring and playmaking ability from him, I mean, when he gets hot, he takes over. And I think that he's a big-time spark plug for this Jazz team that is a little bit middling, not totally knowing where they are in all of this. I think that Danny Ainge, their GM, has just sort of been trying to maximize the value of every single player, every single asset that they have. And I think that they got a really good one in Keontae George, who one of the younger guys in his class as well. So I'm a big fan of Keontae George. I've been talking about this for a bit, so I will leave it at that for there. Jaime Jaquez Jr., of course, one of the most talked about rookies in this class, was just in the dunk contest at All-Star Weekend. He was the 18th overall pick. Now, this was an NBA-ready guy, had spent 4 years at UCLA, had been on some of those Final Four teams in really competitive environments, and it just seemed like it was a natural fit for him coming into the Miami Heat, where he was very ready to go. I just think the intelligence with him is so clearly there. He doesn't make a lot of those rookie mistakes. There's a lot of conviction with him when he is making decisions. He does what he's asked to, and he does so at a high pace. I really enjoy watching him play. As a Celtics fan, I get a little bit nervous because he seems like somebody that is set for a really big playoff series when that comes around. But I think that, again, this was just such a natural fit, him with the Miami Heat. It seems like the players around him really enjoy him as well. I think he's going to be a very, very solid player throughout the course of his NBA career. Definitely on pace to be all-rookie first team this year. Last couple guys here. Brandon Podziemski at number 19. We've talked about him a bunch as well, of course, and the way that he's been able to contribute. I mean, the fact that the Warriors were comfortable enough to, yes, Klay Thompson hasn't been great this year, but I don't think that he's been terrible. And the fact that they had the confidence to go in with Podziemski, put him in the starting lineup, and it sounds like that's going to be their plan for a good bit, because he is another one of these players that is just so smart. He is extremely active on defense, leads the NBA in charges drawn. He hits the shots when they need him to. He's a very good shooter, very solid passer, plays into this Warriors system very well, in my opinion. And I have been definitely a fan watching him. I can't say I knew very much about him. Coming into the league, but I have been very happily surprised by him. And then the last guy on this list here is Cam Whitmore, who went number 20 to the Houston Rockets. This was one of the bigger stories on draft night because he was projected to go as high as 4, and he ends up falling to 20. You know, there was concerns with his injury at Villanova. There was a little bit of potential attitude stuff there, but I think he has been showing his flashes. He hasn't played a ton necessarily for the Rockets this season, only 20 or so games. I'll pull it up right now, but he, missed a lot of time this year. He was injured going into the All-Star break as well, which again is a little bit of a story with him based off of the way that his college career went. Played in 28 games, but he's averaging 12 points per game on 48-40 shooting splits. I think that there is definitely a lot of potential with this kid, and I am excited to see how this plays out because the Rockets are another one of those teams. I guess I fell off of them maybe a little bit as of late, but I think that they're another very fun watch for a young team. So I think that he can definitely play a significant role in their future. On that note, we are going to be taking our final break, and when we come back on the other side, I'm going to be giving my list of NFL teams that have the most pressure to win next season. So stick with us. We will be right back. Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. We are headed into our final segment here where we are going to be talking about the NFL teams that are under the most pressure to win this upcoming season. Now, win can be a little bit fluid. This is obviously talking at least a, conference finals appearance, but for a lot of these teams, I think that there is even more pressure on Super Bowl appearance, maybe a Super Bowl win. Again, varies a little bit based off of the team itself, but I have my top 6 teams here. I know a little unorthodox, but I think that there were 6 clear teams that were under a significant amount of pressure for this year. I do have some honorable mentions for the Steelers, the Jaguars, and the Dolphins. There are some QBs and or coaches that sort of need to prove themselves within this group, and what sort of kept them out of this list for me as a whole was the fact that they are all in the AFC. Obviously, we know the AFC runs through Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs, where the NFC is obviously a lot more open, so there's less excuses there. And it wasn't the sole reason, but it was a little bit of a tiebreaker for me. So getting into this list here, number 6, I have the Detroit Lions. The Lions have been America's favorite underdog the past couple of seasons, dating back to when they were on Hard Knocks and we were really introduced to the character that is Dan Campbell. And they have continually improved over the course of Campbell's tenure there in Detroit, with the comeback in the second half of the season in 2022-23, and then obviously leading up to their NFC Championship run last season. Fair or not, a lot of people were very displeased with some of Campbell's decisions in the second half of that collapse when they lost to the Niners in the NFC Championship. I think he got a little more a little more blame than he deserved, but because nobody really talked about the players themselves unraveling in that one, but he does definitely deserve some of the blame. I think more so than the fourth down decisions, it was the decision to use a timeout on their final drive that essentially made them have to go for an onside kick where the success rate is just so low, and that essentially ended it there. But that's not really the point. One way or another, he faced scrutiny coming out of the game. He faced it on, head on. He wasn't really afraid to sort of take that criticism. And as he put it in the post-game press conference, the Lions are now a known entity. Like, there's no more sneaking up on anybody. Everybody is expecting them to be competitive this upcoming season. So there's no going back. There's no sort of catching teams off guard. And they still have a lot of youth. We've talked at length about their rookie class from last season and how impactful they were. Some of the other young players that they recently drafted on that roster as well and in that core. And I think that what was key for them is they were able to retain both of their coordinators in Ben Johnson, who was an extremely sought after head coach candidate this past offseason, and defensive coordinator Aaron Glenn. So there's not really a ton of excuses for them in this upcoming year. I thought that they definitely deserved to be on this list in terms of pressure, but we have a handful of teams under more pressure. Number 5, I have the San Francisco 49ers. I think they are low on this list for me because I don't think there's anybody's jobs that are at stake necessarily. This is purely reputation based between Kyle Shanahan and Brock Purdy. You didn't really have too many people changing their opinions on these two people based off of the way that the Super Bowl played out. I think that Shanahan is definitely more so under pressure than Purdy is, because Shanahan has been in the moment for a handful more years. He's been there in this same situation without Brock Purdy, and we've talked a ton about him over the past few weeks. We know the story. He's had lots of regular season success. He has an 8-4 record in the playoffs, but people say that Shanahan can't win a big game because he hasn't won the big game, the Super Bowl. Between his tenure as an offensive coordinator with the Falcons and head coach with the Niners, he's won 3 NFC championships. So he's won 3 of the second biggest games, but until he gets that Super Bowl ring, this is a narrative that's going to surround him. The Niners, that is, get to return the majority of their key players. They only have 3 guys that are upcoming free agents that played over 50% of snaps for the Niners last season. That's Tayshaun Gibson, Chase Young, and Sebastian Joseph Day. And the Niners can also get a compensatory, possibly day 2 pick, possibly as high as the 3rd round pick, if Chase Young walks and signs somewhere else. They don't have tons of cap flexibility because of how many guys they have under contract, but as we know, they have a very talented roster, and obviously a group that just went to the Super Bowl. They are more than capable of potentially winning that Super Bowl with the guys that they have in-house right now. So they have the draft to improve some, and whatever other sort of marginal moves they make along the lines in the offseason, but they should be, retooled up, ready to go. They get Talanoa Hufanga back next year. You ideally get Dre Greenlaw back. I know that it was a torn Achilles in the Super Bowl that takes a lot of time to recover from, but ideally by the playoffs, he'll be back for them, and they get a chance to run this thing back. Number 4, I have the Philadelphia Eagles. You have a very loud fan base, a very loud head coach that across the country are not the most popular with a lot of people. I personally thought that unfairly, Nick Sirianni's job was being questioned after they sort of collapsed down the second half of this season. He and the franchise, the fan base, all put a lot of blame on the turnover amongst their coordinators, which is very fair. It is not an easy thing to recover from. So now they come in with a new offensive coordinator in Kellen Moore, a new defensive coordinator in Vic Fangio, who I think they're both upgrades from what they had last season. But they have been a little bit, especially, tons of talk about the tush push, which is also pretty stupid. Anybody trying to ban it, that's I don't know what to tell you. There's nothing unfair about that play at all, other than that they're just really good at it. Still waiting to see what the final decision from Jason Kelce is. I think that would be a huge loss for them if he is done. I know that it was reported that he retired, and then he sort of said that he was sort of still mulling it over. He didn't think that he was in the position right after the game ended to make a fully conclusive decision. So we will see about that. And then Jalen Hurts here, his contract is going to double in terms of cap hit this season for them, and it's going to make its way up to 21 million, 31 million, 45, and then 54 million over the next few seasons. I like Jalen Hurts. I think that he has an incredible story dating back to college, but we have to see how much he's able to elevate his team as his cap hit increases. And I think that there are a lot of people who have talked about Hurts in the past and the sort of lower ceiling there is with him in terms of his full passing ability, which is in part why he dropped to a second-round pick. Number 3, I have the Baltimore Ravens. They were seen to have the best roster in the league this past season, and they fell flat in the big moment once again. And we are set for an offseason and going into next year of the typical discourse where Lamar Jackson has now won multiple MVP awards, wins his second this past season, and now there's going to be a narrative about the lack of postseason success. And there was that narrative sort of coming into these playoffs, which I defended because it had been some years since we actually saw him in the playoffs, and I thought that a more mature version of Lamar and a healthier version of Lamar was going to be enough to sort of overcome that reputation. And even, early in that game against the Chiefs, when he makes that touchdown throw to Zay Flowers, I'm like, oh my God, finally we can move on from this dumb narrative. But of course, the offense really doesn't do much else after that. Lamar Jackson himself doesn't really do anything to, even in the Josh Allen sense, sort of compete with Patrick Mahomes and put on any sort of a show. And we're looking at a lot of statistical drop-offs for Lamar Jackson now. The touchdown to interception rate significantly drops off. It's just a 1-to-1 in the postseason. The QB rate drops off. Yards per attempt are down for him. And I still believe in Lamar, but he does have to prove himself at a certain point. I think that there are also some factors with GM Eric DeCosta and the job that he's going to have to do, because they have a good amount of contributing players from last season that are going to be upcoming free agents. So how they navigate all of that, specifically on the defensive end, in terms of what they choose to do with their money that way. I also am very curious to see how they continue to help Lamar. They go out, they draft Zay Flowers, who has been the best weapon, well, other than Mark Andrews, that is, but the best receiver that he has had during his career in Baltimore, and it resulted in a lot of success. And this is a team that also, dealt with a lot of injuries at running back, but receivers have been a big struggle for them, whiffing on a few first-round guys in the past while Lamar is there. You get somebody in Flowers, and now OBJ, Nelson Aguilar, and Devin Duvernay are all going to be free agents for them. How are they going to retool the offense? Number 2, I have the Dallas Cowboys. They're always going to be under pressure when they just have the spotlight on them so much. But it's even enhanced this year because Jerry Jones said that they will be going all in. Still going to figure out what that means necessarily in terms of what types of moves they're going to make. But there's also added drama, as Cowboys legend Emmitt Smith called them out a few weeks ago, quoting them saying their attitude is something along the lines of, "We are the Cowboys, tell me how good I am." He mentioned the lore that comes with Cowboys football and the flaunting it on social media. Potentially took a shot at Micah Parsons in terms of the podcast. But, this is sort of getting to be a point where we're seeing this drought without even a conference championship appearance. And, for especially a team that is going to be going into a handful of very big financial moves they need to make, paying CeeDee Lamb, paying Micah Parsons, and paying Dak Prescott going into his final year of his contract. NFL insider Jordan Schultz just said that he expects Dak to, quote, command somewhere along the lines of $60 million a year. And, he had a great season this year. He was an MVP candidate, but that is a ton of money to cough up to one guy, especially when you have a bunch of other young talent on the roster that you need to pay as well. They bring back Mike McCarthy for another year. This has to be a prove-it year for him, so definitely a lot of storylines around them. Then my number one team that I think is under the most pressure to win this year is the Buffalo Bills. I think there are many people within this building in Buffalo that have the pressure on their backs. A lot of people were saying that Josh Allen was in this conversation with Mahomes and that they are the current age Peyton versus Brady rivalry. Mahomes is now 3-0 against Allen and the Bills in the playoffs during this stretch. They beat them in the divisional round this year. And early on, Tom Brady got the best of Peyton Manning. So not saying this can't be reversed whatsoever, but it is not looking very good for those conversations early. And I still will confidently say that Josh Allen is a top 3 quarterback in the league, and that Mahomes is also just in a stratosphere of his own. I think that they're just on 2 different tiers despite still being in that top 3 together. It's possible for the perception to sort of change there, but it starts with at least getting one of these matchups in the postseason. And like I said, it's not just on the shoulders of Josh Allen. I think that Sean McDermott still has a lot to prove. He has a regular season win percentage of 64. He's led the Bills to the playoffs in 6 of his 7 seasons there, but he has a losing record at 5-6 once being in the playoffs. So, definitely a very solid coach, but it's a matter of, as far as head coaching wise, and I know that they were dealing with some drama around their offensive coordinator situation, but at a certain point, you have to start winning these playoff games more regularly, and we just haven't seen that from them quite yet. And then I think that their general manager, Brandon Beane, also has a lot of pressure on himself. He dished out a lot of money to Von Miller the other offseason and got a lot of underwhelming return for that. Now, Vaughn was dealing with injuries, so I don't want to necessarily kill him in this. He was an older guy, though, that they decided to give this money to, and they sort of paid the price quite literally. And now they're going into a year where they are currently 29th, according to Pro Football Focus, in terms of salary cap space going into this offseason, and they have some big decisions to make with how they are going to improve this team, decisions to make with Tre'Davious White and Stephon Diggs, where they're both under contract for at least the next couple seasons, but there's a lot of money tied up in them. There's concerns with both of them. White has 2 season-ending injuries within the past 3 seasons, and Stephon Diggs, for as talented of a player he is, he sort of brings that level of drama. There's been plenty of talk of him being unhappy with the Bills during training camp and all of that, and he's been a little bit underwhelming when it is time for the playoffs. So they have a lot of decisions to make, and Brandon Beane is going to have to be the one to sort of right the ship there. But that is my list of the 6 teams with the most pressure to win next season, and that is all I have for today. Thank you very much for tuning in. We will be back tomorrow. Thank you very much to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show, and we will see you tomorrow. So catch you then.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit.